stunning new financial report released by Reuters and several major global institutions has just ripped away the velvet curtain covering the world's largest economy. Its headline alone is shocking enough to make even seasoned analysts blink twice. According to the report, the United States, yes, the same United States that styles itself as the world's ultimate lender, donor, and economic savior, is actually the biggest recipient of financial aid and debt support from China. We tend to imagine America as the benevolent patron writing checks for the world. But behind the scenes of global capital flows, the picture is flipped upside down. The reality, as uncomfortable as it is that America is the planet's largest debtor, and the one quietly keeping the US economic heart pumping is none other than Beijing. The paradox is almost comedic if it weren't so consequential. How did the world's premier military superpower fall into a financial dependency on its top geopolitical rival? And why, despite years of trade wars, sanctions, and strategic containment, has China continued lending lifeblood to Washington? What kind of bizarre creditor-debtor relationship is this? And how close are we to a global financial meltdown once the ticking time bomb of America's $35 trillion debt finally detonates? This latest report, rightly described as the indictment of the century, shatters a 20-year illusion. We see the United States sending tens of billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. We assume America must be overflowing with wealth, so rich that it can casually bankroll global security like a bored billionaire paying for everyone's drinks. But the truth is brutally ironic. While America sends money to the world, China is the one sending money to America. The US plays the role of generous donor only because Beijing has been quietly underwriting its spending spree. The numbers do not lie, and they do not negotiate. For over 2 decades, China was the largest foreign holder of US Treasury bonds, at one point owning more than $1.3 trillion of American debt. And why? Because the US government chronically spends more than it earns, running annual budget deficits that routinely exceed $1 trillion. To plug the hole, Washington manufactures a very special kind of export, Treasury bonds. These IOUs are sold to the world with a simple promise: trust us. We'll pay you interest. We're very dependable. And who had the sheer amount of excess cash to buy these IOUs? The answer is China, the factory floor of the planet, where every incoming container ship and every outgoing shipment from Shenzhen, Ningbo, and Shanghai represented a torrent of US dollars flowing into Chinese hands. But instead of letting these dollars erode under inflation, Beijing had to reinvest them. And the safest, deepest, most liquid market available was US government debt. What followed was a bizarre loop that economists jokingly dubbed a love of convenience. Chinese workers labored 12-hour days producing cheap goods. American consumers, meanwhile, printed credit, swiped cards, expanded mortgages, and bought those very goods. The dollars China earned were lent straight back to America through treasury purchases. Washington then used that borrowed money to fund its ever-expanding military. Over $800 billion a year, building aircraft carriers, bombers, and bases aimed squarely at containing China. A geopolitical paradox so absurd that if Hollywood wrote it, audiences would laugh it out of the theater. Yet this is not fiction. This is the naked, unromantic truth of the 21st century. That is why analysts at S-Data describe the current system as both symbiotic and self-destructive, a financial architecture that sustains 2 superpowers even as it undermines both. This raises the big question: if America is so deeply indebted, why hasn't China simply demanded repayment or leveraged its position? Why does the US economy seem strangely unfazed despite its mountains of red ink? And why doesn't Beijing, the biggest creditor, just call in the debt and end the game? This is the part of the story that few economists dare say on television, because it exposes the chilling power structure underlying the global financial order. It is something analysts have come to call financial MAD, a financial version of mutually assured destruction, the nuclear doctrine that kept superpowers from annihilating each other during the Cold War. For years, China held over $1.1 trillion in US treasuries, effectively a financial nuclear warhead. In theory, Beijing could dump all its holdings on the markets, collapsing treasury prices, sending yields shooting to 10 to 20%, triggering a meltdown worse than the 1980 Volcker shock. The US stock market would evaporate trillions in days. The American economy would fall into chaos. But here's the twisted catch. Detonating the US economy would destroy China too. America is China's biggest customer. If US consumers collapse, who will buy smartphones, home appliances, electric vehicles, clothing, and everything else rolling off assembly lines in Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Shanghai? Thousands of factories would shutter. Millions of Chinese workers would lose jobs. Social unrest could flare dangerously. Beijing's worst nightmare. So the two giants have been locked in a financial chokehold, each squeezing the other's neck, but unable to let go. Yet in 2025, the financial landscape shifted dramatically. Beijing began a strategic escape from Washington's debt web, a quiet but resolute de-risking campaign. China has slashed its treasury holdings from roughly $1.1 trillion to under $770 billion, and the sell-off is continuing. This isn't a panicked fire sale. That would hurt China. Instead, it's a slow, calculated unwinding, selling in small batches and, crucially, reallocating the proceeds. Beijing isn't converting treasuries into cash, it's converting them into gold. The People's Bank of China has been on an 18-month gold buying streak, the longest since modern record-keeping began. China is swapping America's IOUs for physical assets that no sanction, no executive order, and no alliance can freeze. Gold can't be locked, seized, or weaponized by Western banks. This is Beijing sending Washington a chilling message, one written not in diplomatic language, but in hard metal. We don't trust you anymore, and we refuse to remain your hostage. The fear keeping Beijing awake at night goes back to 2022, when one financial shock changed global power dynamics overnight. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the US and its allies did something unprecedented. They froze and seized $300 billion belonging to the Russian central bank. Russia was, in effect, a creditor parking its assets in Western institutions. Yet in a single moment, those assets vanished by executive decision. No court procedures, no negotiations, just gone. For Beijing, this was not a headline, it was a nightmare broadcast in real time. Chinese leaders immediately understood that if they ever moved militarily on Taiwan, their own $3 trillion in foreign reserves, scattered across Western banks, could disappear overnight. It would be financial warfare at the highest level, and the United States, as the world's biggest debtor, would hold more power than the creditor. The Russia shock ripped away the final illusions. China suddenly saw its treasury holdings not as leverage, but as a liability, a loaded gun pointing at its own foot. That is why China cannot dump US debt aggressively, not because it fears America, but because the current architecture traps both sides. The Reuters report is accurate. The US is indeed the largest beneficiary of Chinese financial flows, but that reflects a legacy of the past. The present tells a different story. China is quietly cutting the cord. And once the financial blood supply stops, America's already fragile fiscal body will begin convulsing. Inside the US, the wound is festering. Public debt has crossed $38 trillion, but the debt itself isn't the scariest part. The interest is. After the Federal Reserve hiked rates to fight inflation, America's interest payments exploded. In 2024, for the first time in history, the US spent more than $1 trillion just to service its debt, more than it spent on national defense. Think about that for a second. The world's top military power now spends more on past bills than on protecting the country. This is the blueprint of a financial Ponzi scheme. Borrowing new money to pay interest on old money. If China and other buyers stop absorbing new US debt, Washington would be forced to buy its own bonds by printing money. The result? Runaway inflation, a weaker dollar, gas, food, and rent costs spiraling out of control. A social crisis the likes of which America hasn't seen in decades. Analysts at Forward World are already whispering about a looming failed auction scenario. The day the US Treasury issues bonds and nobody shows up to buy them. That would mark the moment America hits technical default. And ironically, the timing of that moment rests heavily in Beijing's hands. But China isn't just withdrawing money, it's building a new financial empire. Instead of lending to the United States, Beijing is lending to Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. And these loans are not repaid in dollars. They're repaid in oil, minerals, and raw materials, or in yuan. Last month, Saudi Arabia signaled openness to accepting Chinese yuan for oil. This is a direct threat to the survival of the petrodollar, the backbone of U.S. global dominance for half a century. If oil producers don't need dollars, then central banks don't need to stockpile U.S. treasuries. And if global demand for treasuries evaporates, who will fund Washington's $800 billion military machine? China is encircling the U.S. not with warships, but with currency swap agreements, building a parallel financial universe where nations can trade without touching the dollar. A world in which America could default without dragging everyone else down. Returning to the metaphor from the beginning, picture that mansion plated in gold. The homeowner, America, is still hosting grand parties, still spending lavishly. But the neighbor who kept sending food, the neighbor named China, is quietly closing the kitchen. The Reuters data is not just numbers. It is a funeral bell tolling for the age of effortless American monetary privilege. The U.S. has lived for decades on the world's credit card. But now, the bank, China, is slowly shutting down the counter. This entire saga reveals a brutal truth. Real power today doesn't lie in aircraft carriers or missiles. It lies in financial self-sufficiency. The United States may have 11 supercarriers, but if it needs to borrow from its rival just to fuel them, then those steel giants are nothing more than floating ornaments, vulnerable to a single financial flick from Beijing. So the question now hangs over the global economy. What will America do? Will it escalate conflict in hopes of wiping the debt slate clean? Or will it tighten its belt, accept financial reality, and relinquish its post-Cold War throne? We are witnessing one of the greatest shifts in economic power in human history, and it's happening not on battlefields, but on the glowing screens of global financial markets. And now, the million-dollar question, or perhaps the trillion-dollar one. What do you think is the future of the US dollar? And do you believe America is heading toward a default?